When my parents decided to leave for the weekend, leaving me alone at home, I didn't believe it at first. "You're an adult now, Mike," my father said, winking at me. A couple of years ago, they couldn't even think that they would leave me alone, but this time it seemed important to them to arrange a sortie without me. I just nodded, feigning complete confidence, although inwardly I still doubted that I could hold out. It was one thing to be alone during the day, but night always brought with it a bit of unexplained anxiety. And our house was old, and even the creaking stairs, I remembered, seemed especially loud when silence fell. When they left, I tried to occupy myself with everything I could. At first, I turned on the TV and tried to watch some movie, but quickly lost interest. Switched to the phone, ran through social networks, but then I got bored. I walked around the house, checked the locks and windows on the ground floor. The old two-story house creaked and crunched, as if grumbling discontentedly from loneliness. The small attic above the second floor, where I had not entered since childhood, now seemed to me almost the focus of all the strange sounds. There were old photos of my parents everywhere in the house. They hung along the stairs leading up, framed in wooden frames against a background of dull wallpaper that began to recede in places. The photos themselves were from their youth, on the beach, in the mountains, at parties. But the strangest one was hanging in the very corner of the corridor, and it seemed to me that she was watching my every move. In it, they were both standing against the sunset, but their expressions looked tense. I rarely stopped in front of this photo, but now I couldn't resist and froze, staring at it. Suddenly, something from my parents' room seemed to make a noise, and I started. Maybe a draft? Our house is old. The windows and doors sometimes open by themselves. But I went to check anyway. My footsteps echoed down the corridor, slightly echoing in the empty rooms. When I reached my parents' bedroom and carefully looked inside, I didn't see anything suspicious. The windows were closed. The curtains fluttered slightly, but not much. I looked around their room. An old armchair where my father sometimes sat in the morning, a mirror with a worn frame and a vase with dried flowers. Nothing unusual. Just as I was about to leave, something fell from behind me with a thud. I turned around and there was a small box on the floor. She was old, darkened with age, and I had not seen her before. It must have fallen off the top shelf. Inside the box was a bundle of old letters. I took one of them and read it. "We can't leave him alone. You know what's going to happen." The contents of the letters were strange. Swallowing, I picked up my phone and dialed my mom. She didn't answer. Apparently, she and her father were too busy or just didn't hear the call. Then I made up my mind and quietly moved towards the stairs, barely breathing. It was dark downstairs, but I could make out a faint light coming from the kitchen. This confused me. I was absolutely sure that I had turned off the light there when I left. There was the same tense silence in the hallway, and only in the kitchen something was moving noiselessly. I stepped to the door, went inside and froze, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. And then something crunched under my feet. Looking down, I noticed a piece of paper lying next to a piece of a cup lying in fragments on the floor. The paper was crumpled, as if someone had forcefully crumpled it and thrown it, and the text written in a hurry was clearly visible on it. The note read, "We know you're alone." After reading this, I recoiled, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The note, as if glued to me, made me feel completely vulnerable. All my reasonable explanations that this could be just a joke or someone's childish prank fell apart in the air. I looked around, preparing for any movement, any rustle. The whole house seemed to have become oppressively quiet, as if even the walls were trying to guess what would happen next. I was trying to bring myself back to reality. Was it really a joke? Maybe one of the neighbors decided to prank me? But no amount of guesswork could quell the fear that was squeezing my chest. Clutching the note in my hand, I turned and headed back to the door when I heard a slight rustle from around the corner of the corridor. I froze, not daring to take a step. The rustle was repeated, and there was something like suppressed laughter in it. "Mike?" an unfamiliar voice said. It sounded like it was from another world, and there wasn't a drop of warmth in it. I felt a chill run down my spine again. I reached for the light that was still on in the kitchen, but before I could take a step, I felt something cold and hard pressed against me from behind. It was a moment, but it felt like an eternity. I turned around, but I didn't see anyone. Only the darkened kitchen, dimly lit from the inside. It was as if the voice had passed through the wall, as if someone was watching me from the shadows. I closed my eyes, knowing that I had to get out of this house. I took a step back, but at the moment when I was trying to return to the door, it slammed shut on its own with a sharp creak. My breath caught in my throat. I kicked her in a panic, but she wouldn't budge. I noticed that part of the window frames had collapsed. I was horrified to imagine that someone was breaking into our house to get inside. It was only at that moment that I noticed that the note in my hand was starting to crumple. I abruptly unclenched my fingers and she fell to the floor. I couldn't stay here anymore, but I didn't know what to do. The fear was too strong. I rushed to the window, trying to open it, but it jammed. While I was struggling to open it, I thought I heard a rustle again, and this time it was getting closer. I rushed to the back door, which fortunately was not closed. I opened it and jumped out into the backyard, where the cool air filled my lungs. But I didn't feel safe here either. Still feeling the eyes of others on me, I carefully ran along the fence, trying not to make any sounds, as if every uneven board could betray me. Not knowing where to go, I reached for the phone and dialed 911. The display was blinking, but there was no connection, no signal. It was the end. I found myself completely isolated, and at that moment I was overcome by complete despair. Looking around, I noticed that the shadows under the trees in the backyard had become longer. All these sounds that haunted me seemed to gather into a single darkness, ready to swallow me up. I pulled the hood over my head and decided to run to the other side of the house, to the front yard, where the neighbors could see me. I remembered that our guests always came to them when I was little, and even in my worst childhood fears, it always seemed to me that a neighbor named Mrs. Edwards was taking care of us. At that moment, she seemed to be the only chance for salvation. I knew that the front yard was lined with bushes and a high fence, but nothing mattered anymore. My mind was gripped by only one thought: how to get out of here. I jumped up and ran to the exit. As soon as I reached the fence, someone whispered my name again. This time I couldn't help myself. I rushed to the side, not knowing where the real threat might be. I kept running until I hit a wall and sank to the ground. There was a crash ahead, and I turned around and saw someone jump out from around the corner. At that moment, I no longer thought about how it could just be a fantasy. I could hear heavy breathing close to my back. I jumped to my feet and darted to the side, running out into the street again. Suddenly there was a crack of glass, and now I was running, not knowing where was. The speed with which I raced down the street was exorbitant. All I could think was not to look back. Every step echoed in my head like a drumbeat, making my heart pound with incredible force. I didn't know where I was running to, but the thought that I could be safe gave me strength. I felt panic building in my chest as the realization hit me that no one seemed to be going outside. The night was as dark as the abyss itself, and even the streetlights that were supposed to illuminate the road were only faded spots of light, unable to disperse the darkness. I ran through a few houses and turned a corner. There was a small park there that I visited as a child. I remembered playing here with my friends until dark, but now it looked completely different. The shadow of the trees stretched far away like long fingers trying to grab me. I stopped, catching my breath, and leaned against one of the trunks, trying to calm my trembling pulse. Gradually, I got better, and I decided to return. If I knew who it was and what was really going on, maybe I shouldn't have panicked so much. But the thought of being followed was too strong. I realized that I couldn't stay outside for too long. Not knowing what to do, I decided to try to make my way back to the house through the backyard. Perhaps it was less noticeable there. I returned and, trying not to make any noise, casually ran past the lighted windows of the neighbors. For a moment, it seemed to me that someone was watching them, but as soon as I went deeper into the shade of the trees, I felt that there was not a single sound left at home. I sighed, trying to calm down, but my leg was still shaking with tension, as if it wanted to give me away. When I reached our yard again, I froze for a moment, listening to the sounds, but hearing nothing. I decided to go to the back door. I really hoped it was still open. My heart was pounding, and I gently pulled the handle. The door gave way, but did not open completely. Something was in the way. I pressed myself against her and tried to push her. It opened, and I quickly closed it behind me when I went inside. Inside, everything seemed too quiet, even unnatural. I stopped in the hallway and looked around. All that remains of my former world is silence and a suppressed sense of fear. Deciding that I would not wait for the next sounds, I headed for the stairs, knowing that I could not just sit still. I had to figure out what was going on, and first of all, where these strange sounds were coming from. I went up to the second floor, knowing that nothing had happened in my parents' bedroom. But now I felt that my chances of escape might depend on what I found in the attic. I stood in front of the attic door, which had seemed closed to me before. Pulling on the handle, I froze for a moment, listening to the silence. When I opened it, I found an old staircase leading up. Every step I took reminded me that I might not come back. When I got up, the first thing I saw was a thick layer of dust and cobwebs that seemed to be trying to cover all the corners. The light from the window barely filtered through the curtains. I tried to force myself to calm down because I had to be brave. I began to inspect the attic, trying not to miss anything important. There were boxes full of old things everywhere, and I found a few things that I had completely forgotten about. For example, toys from childhood and old textbooks. But none of this could explain what was happening to me. As soon as I looked around, I heard the same rustle that had not left me since I was alone. It was coming from behind me again. I turned around, and suddenly I felt a chill running down my spine. There was a figure standing behind me in the dark. I couldn't make out who it was, but at the same moment I was seized with fear. I pulled my hood up and pressed myself against the wall, knowing I had to move. The figure got closer. I was confused. My heart was pounding like it was going to burst out of my chest. I turned and ran for the stairs, knowing I had to get out of here. I quickly went downstairs, but as soon as I landed on the floor, there was a sharp knock at the door. They opened, and I ran out into the hallway, realizing that everything behind me was quiet again, but only for a moment. There were footsteps again, but this time they sounded like they were following me. I ran to the kitchen, trying not to think about what was going on. Now, the only hope is that I can open the back door and escape into the night, where maybe I'll find help. I reached the kitchen, and without wasting a second, rushed to the back door. My hands were shaking, and I was trying to control every movement. When I pulled the handle, it wouldn't budge. I was already in a panic when I heard the crash again. It was footsteps approaching the kitchen, and I closed my eyes, pushing away thoughts of what lay ahead. I couldn't stay here. Grabbing the kitchen knife that was on the table, I felt its cold steel inspire me with confidence. If someone really came after me, I was ready to defend myself. I looked around, trying to find a way to escape. Through the window, I saw the shadows in the garden getting bigger and darker. It was as if they had begun to gather, preparing for an attack. The door creaked again, and I rushed to it, desperately trying to open it. This time it gave way, and I ran outside. But on the street, I was faced with an even more terrible reality. I was not alone. There were several figures in the backyard, their faces hidden under hoods, but I clearly saw that they surrounded my house. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat from horror. They were talking quietly, and I couldn't understand what they were talking about. But I felt that it was something terrible. I darted to the side again, hoping that I could run past them and run away. I couldn't believe that all this was really happening, but as soon as I took a step, one of the figures turned and saw me. It was a moment full of fear. I started to run, but they started moving towards me like predatory animals ready to attack. I felt my legs give way. Why are they here? Who are they? With every step I took, I realized that the distance between us was closing. I felt my hopes slipping away like sand through my fingers. I ran to the front yard, hoping that at least the neighbors could be woken up and they would help me. But the moment I ran outside, I saw that the lighting around me was dimming, and a strange feeling of hopelessness enveloped me. I couldn't figure out what happened to the neighbors. There was not a single sound or movement on the street. Everything seemed dead. It was so unnatural that my mind couldn't take it in. I turned to look at the figures again and saw them merging into the darkness, getting closer every moment. Suddenly, they took a step forward, and I, like a puppet, lost the ability to move. I knew that if they got to me, it would be the end. I saw a small shop on the other side of the road. Without going into details, I rushed towards him, hoping that he would protect me inside. When I reached the door, I pushed it open with difficulty, trying not to look back. Behind me, I could hear footsteps and soft whispers that rolled in like waves. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. It was dark inside the store, and there was not a soul. Suddenly, all the sounds stopped. I was leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. I listened, but I couldn't hear anything except my breathing. After a few minutes of agonizing suspense, I dared to take a step forward. I noticed that there was a food rack in the corner, and there was a weak light on one of the shelves. I went to him, hoping to find something that could help me. But the moment I turned around, I felt someone standing behind me. I turned around, and there in the darkness stood the same figure that had been following me from the beginning. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's gaze was cold and impassive, like a predator preparing to attack. She slowly approached me, and I stepped back in despair. I tried to find a way out, but there were only walls around me. I knew there was no chance of escape anymore. I was completely alone, and when the dark hands grabbed me, the realization came like a blow. The seconds flew by like hours when I felt everything being taken away. Hope, fear, life. The moment I closed my eyes, everything was silent, and the last thoughts were spinning in my head like autumn leaves blown away by the wind. It's all over. The life I've been dreaming about for so long has melted away like smoke. I couldn't get back to normal. I was left in this terrifying moment that will never end again. Dark figures stood around, and I realized that there was no escape. I was trapped, and all I had to do was give up.